All right, educators, we're going to move on to lecture 2 of the unit 8-9. When I left off, I was going to talk to you about African American education in the United States from the colonial period on up to the 21st century. Um, as we see the white education develop, we see a parallel of African American education, or really the lack thereof. Um, We see plantation owners during the early republic doing everything possible to keep their slaves illiterate and ignorant. Education in the North was not much better during the early republic up to the Civil War. Segregation was the norm, and integration didn't happen until about 1855, and we know that the southern states fought for segregation well into the mid 1900s, where the famous litigation of Brown versus the Board of Education that you learn about in Chapter 5 was ruled to abolish segregated schools. But segregation wasn't perfect, right? Or desegregation wasn't perfect, because we know that desegregation has brought about de facto segregation. We learned about that in Chapter 6. From 1900 up into the World War II, we saw the junior high school come to fruition. Before it had been primary and secondary schools, and now we have the junior high school coming into play here. I want you to remember John Dewey. I've spoke of him earlier in the lecture 1, but you need to remember him. He's going to become he's a name, and he's going to become. You're going to hear more and more about him as you go through your education, and even as an educator, he was hugely influential. Through the mid-20s, through the mid-1900s, but even up until today, he was part of the progressive movement. And so, anyway, you just need to keep John Dewey's name in your mind, and you'll learn about him more as you go along in your education. All right, back to the lecture. During the early 1900s, we see the cardinal principles come about. We see the comprehensive high school system develop, and the progressive movement have a major impact on schools. However, after World War II, we see a huge shift in education in the United States, where the progressive movement is still affecting schooling, but we see the federal government become heavily involved in education. Before that, it had been mostly states who had been pushing education and bringing it to the forefront. But now federal government steps in, and they do this mainly responding to the international challenges, such as the Soviet Union's Sputnik launch, that the U.S. And as a result, the U.S. government instituted legislation that is called the National Defense Education Act of 1958. So this is important. This is an important step in federal government becoming involved in education. Now, from the 60s, we see the middle school become an important educational concept. I'm a product of middle school. I went to junior high, where we had the 7th and the 8th grade, and then I went to a middle school where we had the 9th and the 10th grade, and then I went to high school, which is the 11th and the 12th grade. Just thought that would be a nice side note for you. All right, so after the 60s, we come into the 60s. We come into the 80s, where we see a national reaction to a national report called The Nation at Risk. Your book talks about this report a little bit on page 59, and this report's very interesting, and it's a major document in the history of education in the United States. I did an in-depth study of this report one summer for my doc classes. And if you're interested in educational history, you should look into it, because it really is the basis for standardized testing and the precursor to No Child Left Behind. And it is the impetus for school improvement initiatives we see come about through the 80s and 90s and on into today, where we have testing and curriculum standards with a focus on the content learners are taught. And this is a big old long sentence, right? Where we see a heavy reliance on test results for evidence of learning. So I'm going to repeat that, okay, because I think that's important for you to get an understanding of what the Nation at Risk has done, the Nation at Risk report did. Okay, so it was the basis for standardized testing, and it's the precursor to No Child Left Behind Act, and it is the impetus for the school improvement initiatives that we see come about in the 80s and 90s and on into today, where we have testing and curriculum standards with a focus on what content learners are taught and where we see a heavy reliance on test results for evidence of learning. Okay, I hope you got all that. All right, so we have covered the entire U.S. educational history in about 15 or 20, less than 20, about 15 minutes. So that's probably a record. Listen, this chapter is really interesting. For me it is because I'm a history buff. But one of the interesting things about this chapter is it lets you know what has influenced education up to today, and in order for us to be able to prevent the mistakes of the past, we have to understand that past. And so I hope you get a good understanding of this chapter 8. I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to move on to the chapter 9, part A, which will be the 3-part of this 4-part series. Adios. See you in a little bit.